May 1945. A Bavarian village outside Munich. Rain beats down on the cobblestone courtyard of a sprawling, centuries-old stone estate. Inside the warm great hall, a defeated German officer sits by a roaring fireplace, sipping aged cognac from a crystal glass. Outside in the mud, a shivering American soldier stands guard, his boots soaked through, his hands raw from the bitter spring cold. The German officer looks through the window and sneers at the guard, refusing a direct order to vacate the premises for Allied quarters. He demands that the muddy Americans sleep in the open stables instead. He believes his noble blood protects him from the indignities of defeat. But a reckoning is riding toward the front gates in an open-top jeep. General George S. Patton will soon deliver a lesson in humility that this aristocrat will never forget. This is the story of what Patton did when an arrogant German aristocrat refused to clear out a castle. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War. Two stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Private Frank Miller was 21 years old from Philadelphia, a rifleman in the 7th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division. He had volunteered for service the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a young wife and a job at a local steel mill. Miller had fought through the brutal winter mud of the Vosges Mountains and had seen half his company wiped out during the crossing of the Rhine. His left shoulder still carried a jagged scar from a piece of German mortar shrapnel that had nearly ended his life 3 months earlier. He was exhausted, his uniform was ragged, and his combat boots leaked freezing water with every step he took. On this wet afternoon, he was assigned to secure the perimeter of the Grand Estate, a task that placed him directly beneath the balcony of a man who viewed him as nothing more than a peasant in olive drab. Major Baron Ulrich von Schliessen was 46 years old, a career officer from an ancient Prussian military family whose ancestral roots in the region ran deep. He had never served on the brutal Eastern Front, spent the entire war in comfortable administrative postings, and still wore a tailored, unsoiled dress uniform adorned with an immaculate Iron Cross. Von Schliessen firmly believed that the collapse of the Third Reich did not change the natural order of European society, declaring to his staff that a uniform did not make a gentleman, nor did a temporary defeat erase 400 years of noble bloodlines. He maintained an unearned privilege of total luxury, including a private wine cellar, silver service plate, and a pair of polished riding boots that had never touched battlefield mud. He looked down from his window at the shivering American private with absolute contempt, determined to maintain his comfort and status, regardless of the surrender terms signed by his superiors. By May 1945, the European theater was rapidly dissolving into a landscape of utter chaos and shifting power dynamics. The formal surrender of Nazi Germany had left behind a shattered nation with no central government, broken supply lines, and millions of displaced people wandering the countryside. Allied troops moved quickly to establish order, requisitioning large buildings to serve as administrative hubs, field hospitals, and temporary barracks for exhausted combat veterans. In the madness of the occupation, thousands of defeated German officers remained scattered across the region, hiding behind old titles and attempting to preserve their pre-war lifestyles amidst the ruins of their country. Many American officers, eager to avoid further conflict and focused entirely on the massive logistical challenge of repatriation, chose to let minor infractions slide. They turned a blind eye to local leaders who hoarded resources or refused to cooperate, preferring peaceful compliance over strict enforcement of military protocols. This leniency created a dangerous environment where high-ranking prisoners believed they could negotiate the terms of their own captivity. They assumed the Americans would respect old European class structures and leave the traditional aristocracy untouched. This widespread administrative indifference allowed individuals like the Baron to maintain total control over vast resources, while American troops slept in the rain. Whole units were left to fend for themselves in the mud, while conquered nobility enjoyed warm hearths and private kitchens. It was a breakdown of military authority that could not endure under the strict gaze of Third Army leadership. The delicate balance of accommodation was about to fracture entirely as a routine request for quarters escalated into a direct challenge against Allied command. The confrontation in the grand courtyard was no longer a simple dispute over shelter, but a battle over who truly held authority in the occupied territory. Captain Robert Vance walked into the great hall of the estate, his boots leaving wet, muddy tracks across the polished oak floor. He stopped 10 feet from the fireplace, removed his soaked wool gloves, and looked at the German officer sitting comfortably in the leather armchair. Vance held a clipboard under his arm containing the official requisition orders signed by the division commander. Major Baron Ulrich von Schliessen did not look up from his crystal glass. He slowly swirled the golden liquid, staring deeply into the dancing flames of the hearth. Captain Vance cleared his throat and stepped forward. "We need this hall cleared immediately, Major. My men have been marching in the rain for 12 hours, and this structure is now designated as temporary quarters for the 7th Infantry." The Baron took a slow sip of his cognac, savored the taste, and then set the glass down on a silver tray. He looked at Vance with cold indifference. "Your men can use the outer stables, Captain. They are quite spacious and entirely suitable for soldiers of their standing." Vance tightened his grip on the clipboard, his face hardening as he maintained his composure. "The stables are flooded, and my orders are for this building. All German personnel must vacate the main house and relocate to the secondary tents in the courtyard within 40 minutes. Von Schliessen smiled thinly, leaning back into the soft leather cushion. "I am a baron of the Holy Roman Empire and a major in the Wehrmacht, Captain. I do not take orders from a middle-class conscript. Nor do I sleep in tents while common peasants occupy my family ancestral home." Vance stepped closer, his voice remaining level, but turning dangerously sharp. "You are a prisoner of war, Major. Your titles mean nothing to the United States Army, and your compliance with these regulations is mandatory." The Baron stood up slowly, drawing himself to his full height and smoothing the front of his spotless tailored tunic. His iron cross caught the firelight. "You do not understand your place, American. This land belongs to my family, and your temporary presence does not alter the natural hierarchy of Europe. I will remain in this hall, and your muddy infantrymen will sleep where they belong, outside in the dirt." Vance looked at the German for 3 long seconds, realizing that words were no longer effective. He turned on his heel without saying another word and walked out into the rain. The report reached Patton within the hour. The rumble of a heavy engine cut through the steady drumming of the rain outside the estate. A covered olive-drab jeep splashed through the deep mud of the front gate and came to a sudden halt directly before the grand entrance. The front passenger door swung open, and General George S. Patton stepped out into the wet gravel. He wore a crisp, perfectly tailored service uniform with 4 silver stars gleaming brightly on his helmet and a pair of ivory-handled revolvers resting against his hips. He did not look at the mud or the sky as he strode up the stone steps, his polished boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. He walked past the guards and straight into the great hall, his cold presence instantly silencing the room. Patton stopped 5 feet from the fireplace and fixed his eyes on the German officer. He stood perfectly still, his voice low and quiet as he spoke. "Are you the officer in charge of this facility, Major?" The Baron leaned back slightly, adjusting his collar. "I am Major Baron Ulrich von Schliessen, and this is my ancestral estate." Patton did not move his head. "Did you receive a direct order from a captain of the United States Army to vacate these quarters for American infantrymen?" "I did, General. But those men are common laborers, and I am a nobleman." Patton took a single step closer, his eyes narrowing as his voice grew even quieter. "So you believe your bloodline entitles you to a warm hearth while my combat veterans sleep in the mud?" The Baron remained silent, offering only a sharp, defiant nod. Patton studied him for a long moment. You stand here wrapped in the delusion that your old titles carry weight in a world you helped destroy. You speak of noble ancestry and natural hierarchies as if the iron cross on your chest can ward off the reality of your total defeat. You sat in comfortable, administrative offices, while the men you call peasants bled in the freezing trenches of the Vosges. My soldiers crossed the Rhine under a hail of mortar fire, while you hoarded fine cognac in a private cellar. They have earned the right to every dry roof in Germany, and your 400 years of family history will not buy you one single night of luxury at their expense. The general reached down and touched the grip of his revolver. You have two options, Major. You will either pack your personal belongings and clear this entire building within 5 minutes, or you will experience firsthand the exact accommodations you deemed suitable for the men who conquered your army. The choice is yours, and your time begins right now. The Baron stared at the 4 stars on Patton's helmet, his defiance slowly evaporating into a cold, trembling silence. He lowered his eyes, bowed his head, and began to pack his bags. American military police officers moved into the Great Hall within seconds of the general's command. They began packing the Baron's leather trunks with heavy silver platters, crystal decanters, and tailored silk shirts. The proud Prussian aristocrat watched in frozen silence as his private stock of aged cognac was loaded onto the back of an open-top cargo truck. He was marched down the sweeping stone staircase and out into the freezing spring downpour. The local villagers stood along the cobblestone courtyard, watching in stunned silence as the man who had ruled their valley was stripped of his comforts. The Baron was escorted directly to the outer stables, the very place he had designated for the American combat veterans. The floor of the structure was covered in 3 inches of stagnant, freezing water and rotting straw. The air smelled strongly of damp earth, wet manure, and decayed wood. The military police threw open the wooden gate and forced the Baron inside, locking the heavy iron latch behind him. His polished riding boots sank deep into the cold mire, and the hem of his spotless dress uniform quickly soaked up the dark, filthy water. From the high stone balcony of the main house, Private Frank Miller watched the entire proceeding while wrapped in a dry wool blanket. He stood by the roaring fire that had previously belonged to the aristocrat, holding a warm metal canteen cup of black coffee. The heavy stable door remained bolted from the outside, keeping the defeated officer confined in the tight, crowded space. The physical boundary of his unearned privilege had been utterly shattered in full view of his former subjects. Private Frank Miller returned to Philadelphia in the autumn of 1945. After receiving his honorable discharge from the army, he reunited with his wife, resumed his position at the steel mill, and raised 3 children in a modest row house. The shrapnel wound in his left shoulder troubled him during the damp winter months, serving as a permanent physical reminder of his sacrifice. He lived a quiet, industrious life, never boasting of his wartime service, and passed away surrounded by his family in 1982. The metal canteen cup he used to drink coffee in the Grand Hall remained on his fireplace mantel for the rest of his days. Major Baron Ulrich von Schliessen was transferred to a primary Allied detention facility near Frankfurt, where he underwent extensive denazification processing. He was released in 1948 and returned to Bavaria, but he found his family ancestral lands divided and his social standing permanently erased by the post-war government. He spent his remaining years living in a small apartment in Munich, writing bitter letters to local newspapers about the decline of traditional European culture. He died in obscurity in 1963, never having set foot inside the stone estate again. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident in his public briefings, viewing it as a routine administrative correction rather than a major tactical event. He kept the official report filed neatly inside his field desk until his untimely death later that year. In a private letter to his wife, dated 2 days after the encounter, he offered his only written reflection on the matter. He wrote that an arrogant man must always be broken by the very thing he uses to look down on others, or he will never learn the true meaning of defeat. Some historians have argued that Patton's enforcement of mirrored punishments during the occupation was unnecessarily harsh, bordering on petty theater, rather than professional military governance. They claim that humiliating high-ranking aristocratic prisoners did little to stabilize the region, and instead created deep resentment among the local populations. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that such decisive demonstrations of authority were absolutely essential to break the lingering arrogance of the old Prussian military class. They maintain that immediate, public consequences proved to the defeated population that their former titles would no longer insulate them from reality. What is certain is that the structural authority of the old European hierarchy was shattered, leaving a permanent record of absolute accountability. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have offered a softer alternative to the defeated baron? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.